All right. Thursday evening edition of the Baker Fairburn Hockey Show is live here on YouTube tonight. We're not broadcasting this one out to X. And lots to talk about, as always, with this 2024-25 edition of the Buffalo Sabres. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I am Kris Baker. As always, you can find me on X at Sabres Prospects and pretty much at Sabres Prospects across the board on social media platforms. As always, I'm joined tonight by Matthew Fairburn, Sabres writer for The Athletic. You can find all of Matthew's work at theathletic.com/Sabres. This broadcast is always available on YouTube on the Sabres Prospects YouTube channel. If you could please, on your way in, when you're watching this video, hit that like button, subscribe to the Sabres Prospects YouTube channel, hit that notification bell so you know when Matthew and I go live. You can find the Baker Fairburn Hockey Show on Apple or Spotify, or really wherever you get your podcast. We are everywhere. And if you could please follow along, leave a 5-star review. All right, Matthew, it's been a little bit since you and I talked. I think it was last Friday that we got together. And since then, the Sabres have run their current winless streak to 11 games. They've now fallen into last place in the NHL's Eastern Conference. Quite a change of events from how we were talking about this team on Thanksgiving. Kind of interesting. The Sabres' most recent loss was a 6-1 loss up in Montreal. I was on Sabres Live that day, Matthew, and at the time, midday, the Sabres were actually road favorites going into that game. Two, kind of evenly matched statistical teams anyways, and I guess it maybe made sense. By the time the puck dropped, though, all the money came in. Montreal, that line shifted dramatically at puck drop, but I did find it kind of not comical, but interesting that the Sabres were road favorites for that game. But at any rate, we're coming up here on the NHL holiday roster freeze at 11:59 tonight. We've seen some deals this week in the NHL that maybe we could talk about. But the big news, I think, surrounding this team today, if you go back and Lindy Ruff's press availability recently, he's mentioned how the answers have to come from within the room. And Lindy talks a lot about the team maintaining its composure and not succumbing to the pressure, and he needs to rely on his best players. Well, it sounds like they're going to get a key player back in the lineup the next time they take the ice with the return of Rasmus Dahlin following his 7-game absence. So you've been down at the arena. You've been kind of tracking the Dahlin story. You were down there. They skated today, right? Dahlin was out there, full participant. What's your update on Dahlin?
He was a full participant, participated in power play work, and he is ready to go. He said he's going to be good to go to play against the Leafs on Friday night, and I can't think of a moment in time where the Sabres have needed their best player and captain more than they do right now. It's, an important piece of context in the 11-game winless streak that 7 of those games were played without Rasmus Dahlin, 7 and change because he went out during the Colorado game. Does not excuse what has happened in the 11-game stretch, but it is a layer of context, and it shows how valuable he is to the team in a big way, because defensively they have been, that's probably been their biggest problem during this 11-game streak, is the amount of chances they're allowing, the types of chances they're allowing, their inability to quickly transition the puck. All of those things Dahlin helps with. But, as we'll get into throughout the show, it is probably a bit too little too late after what the Sabres have done here the last couple of weeks. But that was the positive update from practice. The negative update was that Jordan Greenway had surgery on that mid-body injury that's been nagging him, and he is out long-term. They do believe he will return this season, but, he is in the long-term range. They didn't put an exact timetable on it, but they're going to be without him for quite a while. And I would say he has been, when healthy, one of, if not their most consistent forward, especially defensively, and he's a major piece on their penalty kill. So you get Dahlin back, but you lose Greenway. That is, certainly you'd like having Dahlin back, but, it seems like every bit of good news comes with a little bit of bad news with this team lately.
Yeah, I don't want to go with the mid-body reference, but that is kind of a kick in the gut, losing Greenway for sure. You took the words out of my mouth. I think that I found him to be definitely their most consistent forward when he's been in the lineup this year. The impact on the lineup for all the reasons you just mentioned, but also the experience. He's got a good book of experience in his NHL career for a team that's young. Losing that consistent element, that defensive, I don't want to say anchor from the forward position, but certainly a big part of it, and the net front. No doubt, I think that he has been a factor in front of the net this year, and that's helped him be one of those consistent forwards. So no, good news, bad news. I think if you have to take the trade-off, you're going to take the trade-off by getting Dahlin back in the lineup. I think the big thing there also is his impact on the power play. We've seen the power play struggle. I think that helps settle some things down. So I think now it's just a matter of how quickly can Dahlin get back to his playing speed, to get his game legs, how ready to go is he? And we will find that out tomorrow when the Sabres host Toronto, nationally televised game. We've seen a lot of Leafs fans come in and infiltrate KeyBank Center, expecting the same tomorrow. Going to be a hostile home environment for the Sabres tomorrow, but at least they are getting Rasmus Dahlin back.
Yeah, when you say that the Sabres are hosting Toronto, you mean all of Toronto.
Literally. Yeah.
I mean, they are playing host to quite a lot of Leaf fans. I'm curious to see what that will look like because it was ugly in the spring last year, and fans who have bought tickets have every reason to want to get rid of them at this point and be motivated to get rid of them, but also pretty good timing on the schedule if you are a Canadian hockey fan to come down the weekend before Christmas. It's a Friday night. There's factors at play that could make it even worse than the spring. So I'm curious to see what that looks like. It's certainly something that a few of the players have thought about, and given the timing of everything, not great for this team that has struggled to get out of its own head for the last couple of weeks, really since the Colorado game.
Yeah, there's late season Christmas shopping that can happen with folks coming down over the border. The big winners here are the local establishments downtown. They usually do pretty well when the Leafs come to Buffalo. But yeah, I mean, we're not here to talk about the economic boon that comes with the Maple Leafs being in town.
Might be a sellout, right? They could use one of those.
They could use a sellout. Sure, you're right about that. Interesting note, something that you pointed out to me in this 11-game winless skid that the Sabres are on. There were kind of two key moments in that when certain members of the organization addressed the team and then the subsequent effort from the Sabres after that. Do you want to kind of point that out? Because my big thing when I look at this is that, look, they've lost 11. They've lost them in different ways. They've been in a lot of the games. There's been some 1-goal losses. They've had leads. They're scoring first more often. It doesn't feel like your run-of-the-mill 11 gamer, honestly, even though at times it does for sure. But there's two kind of key moments in this stretch and maybe some surprising efforts that happened after that. Do you want to kind of explain your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So like you said, this hasn't been 11 awful games from the Sabres, but they have sprinkled in some really bad games. They started off this streak 1-0 against Minnesota, 4-3 in overtime against Vancouver. I don't think anybody was sending out the alarm bells. Disappointing after, the way they came home from California. They played a bad one against the Islanders, lost 3-0. And then they had that Colorado game that felt like the one that turned this from a rough patch into a potential tailspin.
Yeah.
And so they lose to Winnipeg in overtime the next game. Kevin Adams has his press conference the day after the Winnipeg game. The day after Kevin Adams' press conference was the 5-2 loss to Utah, which I would say was probably now the second worst game in this streak, right there with the Islander game, 3-0. That was a pretty lousy game from them on the road. After that, they lose in a shootout to Detroit. I thought they got bad goaltending from James Reimer. They lose 3-2 to the Rangers. Not a great game, but again, another 1-goal game. They lose 4-2 at Washington when they needed an empty netter, and Washington's one of the best teams in the league. So you're not at that point you're hitting 9 in a row, so you're starting to gnash your teeth together over the way this team is playing. They jump out to a fast start, blow another lead against Toronto, but Terry Pegula goes to speak with the team Monday. They take the day off practice. He speaks to the team and delivers what was supposed to be sort of a reassuring message, a calm the waters type of speech that, the answers are in the room. And the next night you get that game against Montreal. So the 2 points we're talking about are after Kevin Adams' press conference, you get blown out by Utah on home ice. They scored first in that game too. They
I
took a
believe they
1-0
did.
lead and then got
Yeah.
blown out. It was 5-1 when Yuri Kulik scored a late goal to make it 5-2. And then you have the game against Montreal, which I think most people would agree was their worst 60-minute effort of this streak. Obviously, the Colorado loss was the ugliest because of the nature in which they blew the lead, but the 60-minute total game against Montreal, I think, is probably the worst that they've put forth. So it calls into question, to me, there's so many different ways people are pulling at this team right now for good reason. You could close your eyes, walk into that arena, point your finger, and whoever you land on probably has a little bit of this. That's what happens when you are 11 games without a win. But the moments when 2 key leaders spoke, nothing came of it, right? And almost the opposite. It seemed to, and Kevin Adams spoke publicly. Terry Pegula spoke to the team, 2 different settings, but the response was similar the next day. And for a young team, the youngest in the NHL, that maybe doesn't have a lot of direction in a moment like this.
Well, that's where I go with this is the need to continue to develop or find more leadership from the guys playing, the guys in the room.
Right.
You mentioned leadership, ownership, front office leadership addressing the team. At the end of the day, you need the leaders on the ice carrying, leading by example. I think that's where you were going. That's my one answer to that whole thing is the leadership on the ice needs to improve, continue to develop, got to find it. And that's where the answers come from within the room. The answer is it comes from the leaders. That's why Lindy says you got to rely on your best players. It's your best leaders.
Yeah. You need
And I still think that's an immature element on the roster in the construction.
I think there's an immaturity that has shown up in a big way during this. And those are 2 moments to me that stand out when you would think these might be wake-up calls, like the owner's in town, or, the general manager has sort of made league-wide news with some of the things that he said. These are moments that certainly didn't inspire the team, obviously, but moments that regardless probably should have woken them up, might have woken up a more veteran team or a more experienced team. And I think they came out in both of those games almost a little more shell-shocked than anything, right? A little bit more like lost. And I think it speaks to exactly what you're talking about is, look, they've done nothing to the roster, right? So whether these guys are waiting for something to be done to the roster, or they're unsure whether something will be done to the roster, or they feel like they need something done to the roster, I don't know.
Yeah.
It could be it's probably a psychological, soup that they're dealing with of, feelings trying to get out of this, especially the guys that have never been through anything like this. But they don't seem to have that answer in the room right now. Maybe it's Darlene. Maybe he's the one that can snap them out of this, but
It's going to help. It's going to help.
not
But
gonna
how
hurt,
much is
right?
the question? Yeah.
It's also a lot. We've seen him put too much on himself in the past and have some trouble with that at times. So there's something to guard against there with he's your captain, he's your leader, but he's a young captain. Just like everything else with this team, youth and inexperience abound across the organization. So it's a delicate time right now for this team in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of justified anger from the fan base. There's a lot of justified apathy from the fan base. People that have checked out. I get, it seems like one person after each game tweeting at me, somebody tweeted me the other night a screenshot of them canceling their DirecTV, which I don't know what DirecTV has to do with it, but there goes a customer for them because they don't want to watch this hockey team anymore. But I do wonder how. Look, the playoffs aren't realistic at this point. They have a 3% chance at the playoffs according to Dom's model at the Athletic. They have a 7% chance to get the number one pick. So they are more likely in his, projections to be sitting at the top of the draft order. But there's still, like we talked about, when it's not as bad as it looks, or there's some pieces on this roster that you could shape it in a certain way. They're not going to be starting from scratch with whatever they decide to do. But how the rest of this goes will determine how a lot of these individuals feel about continuing on through the mess.
The Montreal loss was the inexplicable one, most inexplicable in all of this, I think. Not because ownership addressed the team. It was the way that the game unfolded, just how it went down. They weren't in it. That, to me, was the more painful one. Like, Colorado was at least an exciting hockey game. They were in it. They had jump. They just couldn't execute. Got beat by a really talented team. To go into Montreal, lose the way they did, that was the more painful one for me in this 11. And after the game, when you heard some of the players speak in their post-game media availability, you're starting to see, I think, some cracks. And you wonder if, I don't want to say, I think there's some serious questions going on between some of these players and intimating maybe guys didn't play within the team game plan. I don't want to say finger pointing or anything like that. I don't even know exactly who they were referring to, some of them that were making maybe veiled comments. But that's what's concerning, is that it's kind of escalating to that now. The players are answering the same questions from you and your peers after every game. They're running out of answers, just like Lindy was at a loss for words. And it could get, my fear is that it could get ugly with a rudderless team when it comes to on-ice leadership. That's why I think it's going to be really important to get Dahlin in there. And you worry, though, it's a horrible situation for Dahlin to come back to. Young captain, weight, a lot of weight's going to be on his shoulders. There's going to be expectations of fixing the power play, locking it down defensively. You and I talked off camera about keeping the game in front of them. And it's a tall task with the team that's in first place in the division coming in with that crowd behind them. Are you feeling that from the players? Like, maybe they're going to, not say they're playing the blame game in public with the media, but it's starting to maybe trend that way. Are you feeling that? Are you seeing that? Am I making that up?
No, I think your
instincts, it's okay to say I'm making it up.
I think your instincts are right. I haven't seen a dramatic amount of evidence, but I think it's only natural that you get to a point 11 games in and you have a mix of players in this locker room that, you have some guys that have been other places and that are a little bit older. Connor Clifton, he spoke after the game in Montreal and was pretty blunt and pretty honest about some of the issues that, caused them to lose that game against the Canadiens. I think there's inevitably going to be frustration in that regard. Whether it becomes full-blown finger pointing, locker room torn apart. I haven't seen too much that gives me concern that that's going to happen, but it does feel like it's getting to a point where these guys recognize their reality, and some of them are more frustrated about it than others. But, we spoke about, I think it was right before the California trip, that Lindy Ruff put the standings in the locker room. They're still up there. So you walk in and you can't hide from the fact that you're in last place in the Eastern Conference. And a lot of these guys, I don't know, I think every individual has different circumstances. For some of them, for your Zach Benson and Yuri Kulik, they're young guys. They're thinking, it's just their first couple years in the league. A lot of hockey ahead of them. For a Tage Thompson and Alex Tuck, this is the prime of their careers, right? So now you're almost certainly looking at a 14th straight season without the playoffs as a franchise. But you have to think about some of these individuals who are, Tage Thompson is not getting better, right? This is the prime of his career. This is when he's supposed to be playing meaningful games and, playing playoff games. Same goes for Alex Tuck. He's not going to get better in his 30s. He's 28 years old right now. So that is the frustration I think that will come out, is that as these guys realize another, it's going to be another year without the playoffs. It's going to be another year of being on their couch in the springtime watching hockey. That's where some of the finger pointing may start to leak out in little comments, right? It may, like I said, I don't think it's going to be, I think to my eye, to, my reporting, like enough of these guys like each other that that's not really an issue. But it's hard to not sit there as the 28-year-old guy or the 30-year-old guy or the 32-year-old guy and be like, man, this guy over here or this guy, and start to, especially when you're pulling your own weight like some of these guys are.
Well, yeah, and we're a season removed from their captain wanting to leave and go to a different organization, one of your elder statesmen. I'm admittedly probably too far ahead of that. And I'm not suggesting that it's getting to that point right now, like a boiling point where there is a blame game going on. But you do wonder if some of these players that maybe to ease their own frustration are voicing some concerns about guys that aren't pulling their weight to the coaching staff. And if that dictates maybe some decisions, nightly lineup decisions, whatever, I can see that happening. I think Lindy is going to be open to every idea.
It's happened in the past here. I think that started happening last year, and that was part of the, got lost a little bit in the whole accountability conversation, is that if you're looking at the other guy, you're not really holding yourself accountable necessarily. You're looking for somebody else to, somebody else is making mistakes, or, somebody else should be benched because X, Y, and Z happened. And it's part of just not, the accountability thing seems to come up on our show a lot. It seems to come up in that room a lot. They sort of made it the theme of the season. We've seen during this streak, the benching of Owen Power, the benching of JJ Peterka, Jack Quinn getting scratched. It starts to get really tricky when you're in a situation like they're in, where they're not likely to make the playoffs at this point. It's another lost season. There was a lot of pressure on this season. It's kind of a turning point season, or it feels like it could be one for the organization, for Kevin Adams, you would think, and guys starting to get to that point that so many guys around here have gotten to, where they feel like they're wasting their career, right? That Jack Eichel got to a point where he felt like he was wasting his career. Rasmus Ristolainen, Sam Reinhart. I mean, even by the end, Sam Reinhart, Rasmus Ristolainen, I think they didn't mind the direction that things were going in once they kind of had a reset going on and Don Granato took over and they were showing some life. I think there was a lot of people getting excited, but they also just recognized the realities. Like, I'm sick of being in this spot of just like perpetually rebuilding and being one of these teams at the bottom of the standings. Guys get burnt out of that quickly. And so maybe that's the emotion I would say that I feel from some of these guys and hear in their answers, is they're burnt. Some of these guys are getting burnt out, and that, glimpses of finger pointing may just be a result of that.
Yeah, and you don't want to hear young guys getting burned out playing here, because then you're going to start to get back into that Ryan O'Reilly conversation, losing his love for the game, all of that. You don't want to relive that. The reason I bring it up is because in situations like this, you need the guys to pull each other out. And I'm looking for signs of that, even in their words, even if words sometimes are meaningless. I want to hear more of that. It's hard to maintain a positive mindset. I get it. But the commitment to trying to do that is what I want to hear more from the players. And I know you're shell shocked after a game and you lose another one, and maybe that's not the best forum to get that answer out, but that's still what I'm looking for. And you definitely didn't get that in the 6-1 loss from those players that stood there. And there were a lot of media in that room, I think. There was a lot of media the whole 2 days that the Sabres were in Montreal.
And Montreal is not the ideal place to be in crisis mode as an NHL team, because there's a lot of national media there, and certainly it's one of the strongest media markets in the league. They travel real well as a just the Canadians beat, but even other media members that are based there. So not ideal timing to have the meeting, all of the different things that were going on that made the Sabres the talk of the league. And I think to your point, it brings up an interesting discussion about Lindy Ruff as well, because I think he called this on Sunday the toughest solve that he's been around. And as you pointed out earlier, said he was almost lost for words. That is a 64-year-old coach who has coached the fourth most games in NHL history, over 1,800, I believe. So that was pretty damning, for them to be in this spot where he feels like he's out of answers. And this is a team that has very little confidence right now. And manufacturing that as Lindy Ruff is difficult. What do you do? Do you continue to bench guys? Do you go the angry coach route and lay into them? Because that's probably just going to hurt the confidence more. But you also can't pamper them either, right? You can't just build them up. It's hard to, build them up when they've lost 11 in a row. You have no evidence to point to help build them up. So I don't know. It is a gigantic task as a coach to try to pull them out of this at this point. You're on mute.
Sorry, it's clearing my throat. The cough button. I was on the cough button. I think we need Lindy to go back through his mental Rolodex here. Like, let's not sit here and pretend, even though he's coached as many games that he has, that he's been spoiled to, these riches of having all these successful seasons. He's been through patches like this in the past. He hasn't made the playoffs every year he's been a coach. He's had some non-playoff teams. To your point about, ripping into guys, why not test the waters? You can rip into them, maybe bench them a little bit, do it both. Daryl Sutter used to do it all the time in LA. He had some really good teams out in LA, some pretty successful teams. He used to sit those guys. He benched Drew Doughty one time. Doughty came off the bench. He didn't like a turnover. Doughty skates to the bench, and Sutter, with his bitter beer face, he's like, go sit down there on the millionaire's row with the other two. And it was like their three highest paid players that he benched, you got to do things like that. Test the waters. Maybe they react.
There was a game in Buffalo, not last season. I believe it was the season before that. John Cooper benched Tampa's top line.
Yeah.
And it was a major story that line got benched. And, it does happen, but that is one interesting component to the whole accountability idea. Who has been held accountable on this team? Mostly the same guys and mostly young guys. Henry Okiharju, JJ Peterka, Owen Power, Matthias Samuelsson, Jack Quinn. Has Tage Thompson made similar mistakes that could have earned a benching? I would say yes.
I
Has
can think of a couple plays like in overtime that led to losses, actually.
right.
Yeah. Alex Tuck.
Or nights, yeah, Alex Tuck, nights when that line has been a problem. Is Rasmus Dahlin? I would say yes. So when you start to pick and choose and it feels like it's always the young guys, that can create just as much of a problem for you as not holding anybody accountable, right? So it keeps ringing in my head, and a few people have tweeted at me or mentioned it in the comments of articles, but it rings in my head over and over the conversation I had with Don Granato after he got fired. The quote was, do you want me to punish you or are you an accountable person? Like, do you need to be punished or are you an accountable person? And that is the answer that I think we're getting, is that there's not enough accountable people in that room. Is that a product of sheer youth and immaturity? Probably a
It's a
little bit.
factor.
Is it a product of the culture in the building? I would
It's a
say
factor.
probably. There's a whole variety of things that cause that, but it feels like the biggest problem that is spilling into all the other problems for them. And that's not to say that it's because Lindy Ruff is benching certain players and not others, but I think what we're seeing is that the idea that last year's team simply wasn't punished enough by their coach wasn't tough enough, that was the problem. Obviously not, right? Obviously not, because this roster got 5 new forwards in the bottom 6. This roster, the funny stat that I pulled up the other night, which I don't think is telling of, how they're playing necessarily, but they averaged 21.61 hits per game last season. They're averaging 21.62 now. It was a huge talking point with the new fourth line, Beck Malenstein, Nicholas Obey-Cubel, Sam Lafferty. This was supposed to be, Lindy Ruff as coach. Physicality was going to be emphasized. And
Non-negotiables. Every player's going to hit.
Everybody's going to hit. And they're a marginal improvement, very, very marginal, basically the same.
Even if they have the puck more, which usually implies fewer hits, I think that the expectation was still, and I don't know if they have the puck more or not. I don't know. I'm just saying.
Probably not. It doesn't
But
feel that way.
right. But the
So
expectation would be more physical intensity, more aggressive forechecking, more puck deep, more hits, 2 guys in on the forecheck. And yeah, you're definitely not seeing that. We are seeing a kinder, gentler Lindy Ruff. We talked about the players maybe getting tired, burned out. You can't have questions if Lindy's feeling the same burn. I thought it was interesting the approach that he's taken with Zach Benson. He's not ripping into Zach Benson. He's not coddling Zach Benson either. Took ice time away from him after the penalty in Montreal. I think he mentioned today to you guys, the assembled press, the media, that he's been talking to him, sitting down with him on the bench and talking to him about the penalties. More coaching. Different players respond to different forms of communication. Interesting that he takes that route. But I think there are guys that maybe you have to go after a little harder to kind of scare a better version of their games out of them. Tuck, when the opportunity presents itself. Tage, like you mentioned, because then the other guys see it.
Well, that's the important thing. That is half the time probably why a Cooper does that to his top line, right? Part of it is that he's pissed off about how they're playing, and part of
That's
it
why
is
Daryl Sutter did it in that example that I
right.
mentioned to you earlier.
If I can go after these guys, I can go after anybody, right? And that does matter when you're talking about a team that supposedly wanted this. But I bring it up just to say that I felt like we spoke about this in the summer, shortly after Ruff was hired, even after we heard the players speak at the end of the season. We were obviously talking about Don Granato's job for months before he got fired, in the context of the team needed a new voice. These young players needed to realize they were in the NHL, that they were going to cost this guy that they all liked a job with how they were playing. The whole context with which they framed that season as the window being open, all of those things. It didn't so much, to me, have to do with Don Granato is solely to blame for the disappointing output last season as it did with all those factors. So when they fired him, it wasn't a shock, but when they responded the way they did, the thing I mentioned was I hope that these players, I hope that this organization doesn't think they can just press the coach button and he will fix everything.
Yep.
Now we have Lindy Ruff. He's going to punish me. He's going to punish the guy next to me. Everything's going to be all good, because that is not. Lindy Ruff walked into the locker room when he was meeting everybody. They showed it in that video, and he had the same definition of accountability essentially that Don Granato shared with me. So even he recognizes that it's not really about the punishment. And that's, I think, why he's taking different tacks with different players. And even at this point, laying into a Tage or a Tuck feels like a very delicate thing to do 11 games into a winless skid, right?
That's why I say when the opportunity presents itself, you got to go for it.
It's almost like the window.
If the opportunity presents itself.
But it's almost like the window has passed, right? You're now 30 plus games in. It hasn't completely passed. There's always going to be opportunities to yell and scream or, call guys out. But when you're talking about setting the foundation for how you want the psychology of your team to be, those are opportunities you want to take early to let guys know, so that when Peterka, Power, Benson, whoever gets called out, gets benched, gets scratched, they recognize that other guys, everybody's held to that. Talking about raising the standard. The standard feels lower than ever.
Took the words right out of my mouth. Yes.
It feels lower than ever. After the game in Montreal, Lindy Ruff was talking about the refs. And I'm thinking to myself, we're talking about a missed penalty call for, a game that was 6-1. Like, you let Patrick Laine just camp out and, rip pucks past Luukkonen on the power play. Like, there was a lot of problems besides the refs in that game. And at that point, I don't know. That's where, if you're going to talk about raising the standard, it needs to be raised across the board, and it can't be selective. And it's fascinating to watch it unfold, because I think it's, to me, I'm not sitting here saying they are where they are because of Lindy Ruff. It does expose the other problems in the organization when you bring in the coach that you thought, he's a very veteran, respected, accomplished coach, one of the most beloved humans in the history of the franchise. And he can't get anything out. He can't get this out of the guys. They were a better defensive team in the second half of last season than they are in the first half of this season by leaps and bounds. So that was supposed to be,
Is that goaltending?
I think partially, but not all. Goaltending was better, but
definitely not all in these 11 games for sure.
No, the 11 games they've been bad.
Yeah, the eye test tells you that they've been bad defensively as a 5-man unit. Well, yeah, 6, it's not really, because the goaltender also. Yeah,
they've had some bad goalie games in this stretch too. Yes, but I think it just shows that there's problems that extend beyond coaching. That I'm not sure you could have prime Scotty Bowman in here, and I don't know, how much different it would be going. Who knows? It's not to absolve Lindy Ruff of blame, but I'm also not going to heap all of it on him either, because if you continue to do that, coach after coach, then you ignore the root of the issue, which is the roster and how it's been constructed and how players have been developed and how quickly they've been forced into roles that maybe they're not ready for. I was reading, and full disclosure, the Nashville Predators are having a terrible season, right? But I was reading an interview with Barry Trotz talking about how they're not trading Stamkos and some of these guys that they signed because big thing he believes in is that you need the veterans in your lineup to set the standard, to show the way. And the other piece that he mentioned, the second part of that is so that when you have young players, you can slot them correctly.
Yeah.
And that, I think, has been one of the biggest misses, since Kevin Adams has been general manager, is inappropriate slotting of players. You handed essentially Cousins, Quinn, Peterka these top 6 minutes, and then you're sort of just like married to it, right? It's like, well, if we go get a top 6 forward, we're going to have to bump one of these guys down. Most teams would say, so what? But
2 years ago was the worst thing to happen to the current group. The semblance of success when no one expected it. That's really kind of what it is with those young guys, right? Hey, on the lineup, real quick. Greenway out. McLeod questionable. Lafferty still not close?
Lafferty seems like he's getting there.
Is he? Do we need are we on a watch for a recall? Where are we at on the roster right now? I mean, are we expecting maybe an Isak Rosane call here if McLeod doesn't go?
They're probably going to need to do. Well, if they don't make one that tells you where they're at.
I don't want to do a hard shift, but I was just I recalled the McLeod thing that we didn't cover yet.
They would.
And there's another guy, there's another guy that's been around, long enough and had enough playoff action that you need any experience in this lineup. Regardless of maybe, how he's performed
he's been disappointing. There's
his most recent batch of games. Yeah, after a nice start.
But yeah, I'd say McLeod and Lafferty have both, to varying degrees, been disappointing, but they are the ones that you brought in to be, the sprinkled in some experience, the energy, the speed, those things that were points of emphasis in the offseason that really haven't. I mean, McLeod had his moment early in the year. I think if he is, he had maintenance today, but I always used to think this was funny in the NFL when guys would get rest days or like there's a maintenance day. It's like maintenance. He's probably has maintenance because he's dealing with something, right? Like a guy has a rest day because he's got some soreness. It's like some blanket term that they can use to avoid saying that a guy is injured. But if he has been playing through something, that would explain some of the drop off recently for McLeod.
It's kind of a bummer, by the way, going back to your Nashville comment, what Trotz said about, not pushing the panic button. He's not going to make one of those knee-jerk reaction trades, kind of like what Kevin Adams told you guys a couple Fridays ago, because like the player there, it's like that, Marchessault, and he's a Pat Brisson guy. Kevin did Pat Brisson pretty solid with Kyle Okposo last year. Pat Brisson came in and kind of got Kevin over the finish line, getting the Eichel situation cleared up. I know Marchessault has some trade protection in his contract. I think he's got 4 years after this one and like 5.5. I brought it up, but I can't see it because I got this. I'm blocking my monitor. But wouldn't that be something? Kevin, go to Pat, say, hey, can you talk to this guy? Help me talk to this guy. Get us off his list. We really want him. Like, I just like because you'd expect Nashville and Buffalo maybe to have conversations in a normal world, but Barry is absolutely right. What a smart thing to say about his team. But I've been thinking about Marchessault a lot lately, and again, the fans can laugh, say, why would he want to come here? I'm just saying, we're going to talk about things like that as maybe an example of trying to work an agent, and guys that you've done favors to maybe in the past, maybe trying to get some help fighting this battle to get off certain players' lists. That's all I'm saying. Just, are we throwing crap at the wall? Yeah, to a certain extent, of course. But I just wanted to mention that.
This was the quote from Trotz. And again, the Predators have stunk this year. But Trotz is a pretty experienced hockey man, and I feel like his words carry some weight. It was asked pretty much directly about the idea of trading Stamkos before the deadline. And he said, there's no chance. I believe that you have to have good players that compete in this league. This league is too good. You need the veteran players to carry the way. They have to carry a good piece of the load so that your young guys can be slotted correctly and have success and grow.
That's a
And
good quote.
I don't think that has happened here. So, and that was Trotz in The Athletic today, speaking with Pierre LeBrun. Basically, I think the mindset the Predators have, and they've been active trading, but I think, the gist of the mindset is that they're going to try to reload for next year. Like, they feel like some things got off the rails early in the year. They're probably not going to make the playoffs. It would be shocking at this point if they did. It would be a hell of a turnaround, but they feel like they have a good group in place that, if they'll just take another run at it next year. But that puts some water on the idea of snagging one of those pieces that they signed. But there's always, a futures deal to be made. If they want one of these young core players, you could always change a guy's mind. But maybe Stamkos and Marchessault are not the easiest targets, especially with the trade protection, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
I've just always liked him. I think that his playing style, just like what he represents, his experience would be, it's ideal. Is it a pipe dream? Yeah, probably, but still worth spending, 3.5, 4 minutes talking about. We saw Devin Levi. I'm going to do a hard shift again, back to the roster real quick. We saw Devin Levi come up on Sunday, spot start. You and I speculated about that possibly happening. It sure did. I thought he played a good game for the most part there in Toronto. Sabres have a back-to-back again coming up. I don't know if they would do it again. What's your read? I mean, we saw Reimer come in and mop up duty the other night. Didn't allow any goals, right? I think he shut the door, stopped the bleeding. Do you think that was enough to get him one of these starts? Or do you dip into the Levi pool again?
well, they won't be able to, right? Because of the roster freeze.
Oh, the roster. What? You can't even do a call?
I don't believe you can. I believe call-ups and yeah, I think the roster is completely frozen.
Okay. All right.
Now, if there was an emergency situation, I think you could. Let's look at the rule.
Okay. That's
Make sure I
interesting.
read it right earlier today, because there was some, let's see what the rules and regulations
That's a good
are.
call out if that is the case. I forgot about that roster freeze here for a second.
You can't make trades or put players on waivers.
I don't know why you wouldn't be able to dip into your contracted players that are on your farm team, though.
Especially for a one-game situation, because there are the potential of injuries. I might be wrong here. This is not good content either way, as I try to double check
That's all
this
right.
rule.
That's all
But
right.
you
We'll revisit
freelance
it.
for a bit while
No.
I try to pin this down.
Yeah. So while Matthew's looking at that, and I'll just kind of set the table for, I think, another topic that we should get into here before we call it quits tonight. But we did see some trades. When we were talking about Lindy Ruff and his handling of young players, and it's easy to go after young players and things like that. We saw another team go after a young player, I think earlier this week, when Cabo Caco got sat down, who's been playing pretty well for the Rangers. And we saw a trade happen. I think it was last night. And so that was Caco going to Seattle. Seattle ships out, I think it was Will Borgen and a pick. I don't have it up in front of me, so I apologize if I'm off. I think it was Borgen and a pick for Caco. And my read on that, Matthew, was that was just like a really tough one for the Sabres to watch happen, because I think both of those players would have been of interest to Kevyn Adams. And I'm sure if Kevyn Adams says he's in on pretty much every discussion, and the rumor has been that Kevyn Adams has been pretty active talking to GMs, you would have to think that he was speaking to Ron Francis and Kris Drury, frankly. And those are two players, really. Borgen, you and I think, mentioned him a few episodes ago as a guy that made sense. Right shot, can help lock down the defensive zone, maybe a possible player that can roll with Owen Power. So that was, I think, a tough one for Kevyn Adams to watch go down. Kako's really been coming around. I think in the last calendar year, especially one of those young players on the Rangers roster that's really elevated his game, along with Lafreniere, started elevating his game last year. I don't know. I thought that was a pretty tough one. That was my initial reaction. Was like, wow, that's got to really suck for Kevin Adams to see that trade. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I think there's been now 3 right-handed defensemen traded in the last couple of days, in this week alone. That is probably, outside of a top 6 forward, their biggest organizational need at the moment on the NHL roster. And that trade yesterday, I mean, it underscores the whole point about, Kevin Adams a couple of weeks ago and everything he was saying about no trade clauses and, the difficulty of making deals. You have to find creative ways around it. And I struggle to even say creative ways, because what was so creative about, going to get a Will Borgen or a Capo Caco? Like,
I was surprised. Like, I think it confirmed Will Borgen's value. What did you think of the value? Forget the Sabres for a second. What did you think of the value that the Rangers got?
That is the one part of the deal where, everybody says, oh, geez, you should have just sent Yoki Haru and a pick and you would have gotten. I don't think that's equivalent. Like,
it's not.
I think the physical edge that Borgen plays with is what got the extra boost there. That it's a sought after commodity as a right shot defenseman that plays with a little bit of snarl. And
he's got really good mobility.
Yeah, this was a guy that, could have been in this organization, right? I mean,
block shots. Yeah.
But I don't know that they had the pieces to get Kako the same way that Seattle did. Like, I don't know that they had that piece to offer. And if that was the type of piece the Rangers were looking for to replace a little bit of what they lost in Trouba, then, I'm sure you could have blown them away with an offer and they would have looked for that piece elsewhere. But of course there's a ton of no trade clauses in the league, but it's clearly not everybody, right? And these are guys that could impact your team. Seattle's going to put him in the top 6 and play him on the power play. And, so basically you saw a trade with 2 of your big needs on your NHL roster trade places. 2 guys that are basically off the board now, right?
Who would you have rather had if you were Kevin Adams?
That's an interesting question.
Just at face value of the player. Maybe let's not talk about the acquisition cost.
I think
Chad, who would you rather have had? Kako or Borgen?
Kako, because I think about the upside. I'm looking at a team that is in last place, right? And the idea of white knuckling their way to the playoffs seems crazy at this point. So
another player where you're banking on upside as opposed to a known physical commodity.
Well, a known physical commodity who's a UFA. And, are you going to be able to resign him?
Mm-hmm.
When he's been in your organization before.
That's a good point.
You let him go. That would be my hang up there. Whereas, and yes, he's, Kako's young, maybe has not fully realized his potential, but I do feel like the experience he has playing in New York, it's similar to like bringing in a Bo Byram, right? Where Byram certainly hadn't realized his full potential when the Sabres traded for him. Probably still hasn't. Definitely still hasn't. But it's almost the type of trade. I mean, he's in the age bracket of what you've built. So now, if this were
trade, man, that's an interesting trade. The more that I think about it,
if we were having this conversation when they got back from California, I would probably say Borgen is who I would have rather had, because this was looking like a playoff team, and I wouldn't care about UFA, like any of that. I would say the guy who can solve your problem in the top 4 is the guy that you want. And now, though, I don't know that you can even view trades through that lens, right? A rental when you're in last place. It's too late almost already. And that's why I understand the frustration people have with Kevin Adams, because it is the lack of urgency, the lack of, thinking 2-3 steps ahead, and how so much of the plan just boils down to hoping that guys develop into
Yeah.
and hit their ceilings when we know they all won't, right? Some of them might, but we know that they're not all going to do it. So trying to plug holes when it's too late, even Don Granato last season, in hindsight, they were saying, oh, we noticed some of this in training camp, or, make a move, spark your team, swap them out. And they didn't do that. I feel like he was pretty late in addressing a lot of things, and there's a lot of things that still haven't been addressed. But to go this long without winning a game and not make a waiver claim or a trade or anything, or even put one of your own guys on waivers, is kind of mind-blowing.
Put on waivers, Bryson, or a bigger name, right? I mean, we don't have to answer that now, but on tweaking, and I don't think this would be, because I've mentioned before, like, hey, maybe you don't have to swing for the fence, hit a couple singles, hit a double, whatever, increase your compete level. So St. Louis picks up Fowler. Brandon Saad, I think, was kept out of the lineup recently. He's got a year left at 4.5. Do you expect something there? We've always thought that St. Louis and Buffalo made decent trade partners. I'm wondering if there might be something there. I haven't heard any rumors, really, linking the teams, but I know that you've thought about Brandon Saad in the past. I have a feeling if I know Matthew Fairburn the way that I do know Matthew Fairburn, you're probably looking at it already.
Yeah, he's my kind of player. He plays well against this team. He does have a no trade clause.
12 teams that kicks in next year, though, in the final year of his deal, right?
He's got,
I see 2025, 26, a 12-team no trade clause, which would be
looks
the
like
final year.
before that.
Oh, he's actually got wait, that's a modified. Okay, so you know what he does have? He's got a full no trade.
He's got a full no trade, cannot be traded without approval.
Okay, well,
so that's a roadblock, but he's from Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
So, could you convince him? Might be one that's easier to do in the off season when you're not sitting in last place. He's probably sitting there thinking, if you guys want to trade me, at least trade me somewhere where I could have a chance to win. You do wonder too, relationally, as far as these GMs, and a lot of people talk about the unwillingness to deal with Kevin Adams, or making ridiculous offers, or, I wonder sometimes if GMs are, hesitant at times to send their guys there just out of respect for future deals, right? With agents or whoever else. It's like, man, you sent my guy to Buffalo, but maybe that's making too much of it. Saad would be great though. Net front guy, experienced, a lot of, we talk a lot about getting some more grown men in the room, and, he would certainly be one. Probably not too terrible of a cost either. He's certainly not at the peak of his game. He's on the wrong side of 30, but, maybe because he's from Pittsburgh, you'd have a shot at getting him to
maybe.
But
yeah, and I'm looking. He's got the same agent as Mason Yops and Anton Wahlberg. It's not like there's other, players of significance that the agent reps.
Is that Jeremy Swayman's agent? I feel like it is.
It
Maybe.
is. It is. Yep.
So.
Louis Gross. Yep. Hey, man, we're an hour in. That flew by. I asked you about Levi. Talked a little bit about the roster. We gave maybe, even though Lindy's kind of nearly had a loss for words recently, we're not yet. And I don't expect us to be. We'll continue to throw some things out there. We will hit the chat here because now that the coffee that I started sipping when we hit the live button is finally starting to kick in, get my second wind. Before we do get into the chat, if you could, folks, hit the like button. We love when you do that. We love doing this show. We like the likes. We always appreciate that. But before we get into the chat, Matt, while you're starring a few, what did we learn? We learned that Rasmus Dahlin's coming back. He's going to save the entire team. Hopefully save the power play. Jordan Greenway is a significant loss. We didn't talk much about Yuri Kulik. We talked a little bit about Benson. But yeah, I'm honestly, I know this is kind of different than I think a lot of the hockey watching population in Buffalo. I'm excited for the game tomorrow. I'm excited to see how this team that's in a hole can pull each other out in a tough environment on their own ice. I think they got to get up for that game. They got to get up for that game. If they don't, it'll perhaps even be more telling than that Montreal game, especially coming off that Montreal game. I'm excited to see how this team reacts. It's fascinating. Sports psychology. It's not just, you know what I mean?
They're a fascinating story in general in a lot
Matthew,
of ways.
this tomorrow is about not just the pride in the crest on the front. It's about the pride and the name on the back of the jersey, the personal pride. Honestly, this whole thing is. That's why I get excited about tomorrow's game. And as a teaser, I'll do a little tease, little surprise thing for Saturday.
Indeed.
And I'll just leave it at that. Little surprise for Saturday's game. I'm not going to say anything about that, but yeah, little surprise, little cliffhanger. Matthew, you got anything in the chat that you want to get to?
Let's see. What do I got? These must have been
a little surprise for Saturday that could be good for the Baker Fairburn Hockey Show in the long run. Don't you think?
I don't see why it would be bad.
I mean, it could. I mean, it should be good.
I would think it would be good.
We'll see. Yeah.
Papa Duke mentions, how young are they? Even the young guys, except Kulik, have a bunch of NHL games under their belt. They do, but when you look around the league and you look at the teams they're playing, that have the average age that's 27, 28, those guys have way more games, right? They have games here in this environment, which has not been the best environment to grow. So not all games are created equal. And I think we've maybe touched on this before, but just maturity, like actual maturity. A 22-year-old with 200 games or whatever is still 22 years old. And when times get tough, hasn't seen some of the adversity in life or otherwise that other guys have seen to be able to have just the mental strength to pull out of it. And I think this is obviously a pretty mentally weak team. It's a team that makes a lot of mistakes on the ice and that is obviously struggling to, manufacture the confidence needed to pull out of this thing. And as Jake mentions here, what do you want them to go sign, Craig Anderson? I'll tell you what, when they had Craig Anderson on the team, they got 91 points. So maybe there is something to age.
Craig Anderson meant a lot to that group.
He did. He meant a lot in the room. He came up with some big wins. It was kind of a weird goalie situation where he would only play like once a week tops, but man, he delivered some gems and it was almost like, having a coach in the room. I mean, he definitely meant a lot to the group and they didn't replace the veteran. They tried to just do it like in here and there, like, Eric Johnson or,
you can't overstate it, man. Matthew, you can't overstate the veteran experience in the room on practice days, the morning of games. I was out to dinner last night. I was at the Dog and Pony down in South Buffalo. Love that place. If you guys haven't been there, man, go there. Food is exceptional. Husband and wife came up. We were just talking, and through the conversation, I mentioned, we were talking about the age of the team, kind of like what we're talking about right now. And I said, remember, I think it was probably, I don't even know, 15 years ago, whenever it was, I'm losing track of time, longer than that. Sabres went out and signed Teppo Numminen, and the whole reason they went out and signed Numminen is that he saw every situation in the NHL 10,000 times. It's kind of like the Craig Anderson effect. Those guys that have been there, done that. That's what we were saying this summer. You can't overstate it. The reason I bring that up is because it's important. Even if the player loses a step, still really important. Super important. But anyways, go ahead. I know you have more start.
Well, and when some of the experience that they tried to layer into the lineup, a lot of it is the fourth line. Those guys are in and out of the lineup. And, the guys that have been in there every night are playing, 10, 12 minutes. They're not the standard bearers for what you're doing on the ice. Zucker has been that, but you need more Zuckers, and you needed to be layering them in 2 years ago, not, one guy now. It needed to be go back to that Trotz quote, right? You needed to be appropriately the idea of not signing Zucker 2 years ago was so that JJ Peterka and Jack Quinn could have their top six, their power play time, this and that. But that is probably not the ideal way to develop those guys. And now you're seeing bad habits from both players, or they're hitting this adversity where different things are expected of them because they've been in the league for a couple of years. And if you had slow played them a little bit more, you would be in a much different situation with both players. And you'd probably be in a different situation, as far as contracts and staggering contracts and all of that stuff. So yeah, I won't go away from the age point for that reason, because I think there's too much evidence pointing to the fact that you need more experience. And the biggest evidence of it is what's happening right now. 11 straight games. Something that, I don't know. It got to 12 when they fired Ralph Kruger. I don't know how many GMs in NHL history have had 2 12-plus game winless streaks. 4 seasons apart, right? If I'm doing my math correct. Because that was 2020, 2021. So there's been 3 seasons in between. And now you have another one. This is where you are. This is what you are. This is what you've built. So I don't know,
Matthew, I hear you. No, we almost will beat the dead horse if we keep talking about the age thing. And we know it's a sensitive topic with the team based on the answer you got when you asked the question a couple Fridays ago. I have a quick question from Dave Zago. So he's asking about Greenway. Will Greenway be put on long-term injury reserve? What does that do to the cap? My expectation is that, based on the sound of it, at some point he's going to be put on LTIR if he's going to be out for a significant amount of time. I know it probably wasn't discussed today. My expectation is that he would.
It depends what they mean by long term, because Samuelson was in that bucket when Lindy Ruff described his injury, but he never went there.
And Samuelson came back a lot quicker than it sounded like he was going to be out.
Yeah, because he didn't need surgery either. He didn't need surgery. So Greenway maybe does. And what does that do to the cap? I don't know. It gives them even more cap space. What does he make? $3 million more cap space that they probably won't use. So I guess it's an inconsequential point in the sense that, hey, maybe they've got something up their sleeve, but they've had plenty of time to use that cap space. That's what gets me, is the kicking the can down the road, right? In the preseason, the question about cap space gets brought up, or in the summer, and Kevin Adams says, well, if the opportunity arises in season to make a move, now we have, the flexibility. What better opportunity is there than your team being in a tailspin to make a move and jolt your roster?
one thing I just thought of, and it was kind of inspired by Jay's question here. Jay's asking, what is our realistic trade bait come the deadline if we don't make a huge swing here? There's a couple names, I think, like you could talk about Peyton Krebs. I think Jason Zucker becomes, I think a trade piece. I don't think he's going to get moved for a 6th at the deadline like he did last year. But what does it do to Jordan Greenway's potential trade value at the deadline with him on an expiring contract, this injury?
That's probably the better question, because
Yep.
you have to start to wonder whether a guy like Greenway, Zucker, whether those guys want to be back. Henry Okiharu falls into that camp as well, because he's an unrestricted free agent as well. So what's your ability to re-sign those guys?
Yeah.
I think Greenway would have been fine, 6 months ago, but another guy that's getting up there in age and probably would like to play in the playoffs again. Zucker is in that exact same boat. So, I mean, he's even older than Greenway. So
Zucker's really helped himself become an attractive commodity again. I don't want to say it was like he reclaimed his career or anything like that. It was surprising to see him go for a 6th last year. I could see teams lining up to get him at the deadline, honestly, even despite the $5 million, because he probably would be worth that number at that point in the season to a team in the hunt. Depth.
Well, then it
Look at
calls
that. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Calls into question, would the Sabres retain some of it?
You only have so many spots that you can retain, though, right?
So but they're not using any of them.
Any of them. Yeah. No, you're right.
They haven't. I can't remember in my time on the beat that they've retained salary on a trade.
No, I think you're right on that. And Jay Biggs, to your question, there are huge swings that they can make. We talked a little bit about this, I think, the last time Matthew and I are together. Some ideas. Like, I don't think it's an in-season thing, but there are big. You hear a lot about Cousins. I don't want to rehash the whole podcast that Matthew and I did. I'd encourage you to go back and check it out. But I would consider like an Owen Power, especially if you think that Bowen Byram is part of your long-term plan. Again, I don't want to rehash the whole conversation, but that would be, I think, a big swing. That would get some. You're going to cast a pretty wide net of suitors if that name becomes available. But no, back to the non-huge swings. I think it's the expiring contracts. I think there's players like Krebs. I do look at Zucker for sure. I look at Zucker. I think that, he's going to be pretty attractive. Got anything else starred, Matthew?
That was it, actually.
Oops.
So
let me take that down.
We're at 112. So I feel like it's a good place to land things here.
Yeah. Hey, listen, the numbers have been better than I thought they were going to be tonight. You hear a lot to your earlier commentary about folks, just, what's the point? People aren't into the Sabres right now. Listen, there's a couple different ways that you can go, especially when you do a show like Matthew and I do. You can go on and just bitch about the team. And, it becomes like a woe is me type of thing for the fan base, which I get. And the fans are more than you can feel that way. Trust me, I totally get it. Or you consider you can just try to talk, have dialogue, work with the chat, try to figure out ways to solve the problems with the team. We're committed to doing that. We're going to keep doing that. We're never going to run out of things to talk about with this team. I appreciate people coming in here. These numbers have been better than what I expected tonight. Right before I hit the live button, I said, no one's going to be in here tonight. I was wrong. So thank you everyone for hopping in. I see some new faces in here too. New names. It's great to see. Love seeing that. Matthew, plugs before I take us out of here.
You can find my stuff at theathletic.com/sabres. And I think we have a holiday deal going on at The Athletic right now. So good time to jump in. I don't know the exact specifics of the deal, which is bad marketing on my part, but that's my plug. Find me there, find me here, on various social medias at my name. And yeah.
And if you do go to theathletic.com/sabres and you come across one of Matthew's stories and you're considering subscribing to The Athletic, do it through one of Matthew's stories.
Always helps.
I think that's a good little gesture in this holiday season. Let's throw Matthew a bone. So that's it for me. No plugs here. We're going to see you again very soon. And until then, for Matthew Fairburn, for the production crews trying to figure out what's Kris talking about this Saturday surprise. We'll see. I'm Kris Baker. Thanks everyone for hopping in. Hit the like button on your way out. Appreciate it. We'll see you again next time.